Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, and I'm terribly grateful for the welcome I've received to this beautiful city of Chicago that I've never visited before. You have a wealth of wonderful things to enjoy here. Before I get into my talk, just ever so briefly, I might just share something with you that appeared in this morning's press from Australia. George mentioned the resolution that was passed in the New South Wales, I'm from Victoria, not from New South Wales, it was passed in the New South Wales Parliament on the 1st of May. This morning I awoke to an email that stated that the Turkish government has threatened that any Australian politicians from New South Wales who want to go to Turkey will be refused entry henceforth. Just thought I'd share that little vignette with you. We have a lot of work to do still, don't we? But that's not what I'm here to talk about right now. I'm here to talk about survivor testimony. The uses of survivor testimony are many and play in fact, the most crucial role in forming our understanding of what life was like in times of genocide. Testimonial accounts are our primary link to the Ottoman atrocities as viewed from the victim's perspective. As such, this is my opinion, perhaps you share it with me, all accounts are vitally important documents which must be considered and, I would say, respected as historical data. They are the reminiscences of men and women who were persecuted under inhuman conditions with no guarantee of survival. They came from all walks of life and from all corners of the Ottoman Empire. Their accounts were produced from the perspective of a few months or after the reflection of many years. And I think it's important now and for future generations that we keep in mind also that they were rarely originally produced in English. From this point on, most people will be reading translations into English, and there'll be no opportunity of follow-up with the survivors themselves. Put quite simply, and I'm saying this for future generations in this country and in many other countries besides, what we have remaining today is all we're ever going to get. Now, I've had to deal with these reflections while I've been working on my current project, a book entitled Encountering Genocide, Personal Accounts from Victims, Perpetrators and Witnesses. I have here with me the latest version of the manuscript. It's immense. I haven't yet forwarded on to my publisher what it's currently looking like, because I don't want my publisher to have an apoplexy. It's getting bigger as the time goes by, and this is one of the fortunate things that we find with survivor accounts is that the more we dig, the more we find, though that too, of course, is finite. I've found that the accounts in doing this, I've found that the accounts of victims, perpetrators and witnesses all present very different challenges. I'm here to talk today about survivor accounts, not those of perpetrators, though I do have in my book an account of a Turkish perpetrator, and witnesses, but I'm here to talk about survivor accounts. And what we're dealing with when we look at accounts by survivors is a very special type of memoir. A very special type of memoir that requires both sensitivity and careful deliberation. And for today, I've taken 3 accounts, one each from the Armenian, Assyrian and Pontic genocides. George makes a good point when he says should we use the plural or the singular. I've divided them into the 3 as 3 individual experiences, if you like, coming under one umbrella. The first is from a woman called Sevli Krikorian. She was a little girl at the time of the genocide. Sevli was born sometime in the spring of 1911. We don't know precisely. She doesn't know. She didn't know. She was born in the Armenian village of Jibin. As a child, she was given up for protection by her mother to a Turkish woman who promised to safeguard Sevli's life for as long as she lived, which the Turkish woman said was not expected to be very long, but I'll take care of her. It was said, I'll take care of her when you, she was talking to Sevli's mother, when you go there with all the others, I'll take care of the little girl. Her motives in making the offer are an open question. We don't actually know why she was always known as the Turkish lady. Sevli didn't know her name. We don't know why she made the offer. Perhaps it was out of pity. Speculation within the family was that it was in order to either obtain a daughter. The Turkish lady had two sons, 2 older sons, or perhaps it was to gain a source of cheap household labour. That was another possibility discussed within the family later. Regardless, as the account shows, as Sevli's account shows, her life was saved through this woman's action. The account, and I cannot go into the account here, there's just no time to go into that, but the account itself shows a remarkable recollection of detail as seen through a child's eyes. We'll talk about that in a moment. The second account is from the Reverend Joseph Nahum, an Assyro-Chaldean priest from Urfa in Turkey's southeast. His account makes him one of the key witnesses of the events surrounding the Ottoman destruction of the Assyrians. In 1920, he wrote a book on his experiences entitled "Shall This Nation Die?" It was published in New York in 1920, as I said, 1920. And it contained an account of Father Nahum's experiences, as well as observations of the genocide of the Armenians and the Greeks. There's a great deal of observing taking place. Those observations were taken from Assyrians and related to Father Nahum as he spoke about what they had seen. So you've got the confluence there, if you like, of the 3 experiences as witnessed. Father Nahum's testimony was one of the first major statements alerting an English-speaking audience to the horrors perpetrated against the Assyrians during the Great War. The final account that I'll be discussing is that of one man we know only by the name of Papa Yanis. In chronicling the story of Tamama, a Greek girl lost to her family and raised as a Turk in the aftermath of the Pontic Greek genocide, author George Andrianis interviewed a number of people and encountered an account of Tamama's father, Papa Yanis, who was one of the leaders of the community of Espia. Through him, we learn, through George Andrianis, we learn of the fate of Papa Yanis' brother, Kostas, and of the Pontic community of Espia as it was being forcibly deported to an unknown destination. I'll be discussing all three of these momentarily. Just want to ask a question though, it's a rhetorical question, this is not a quiz. And the question is, what general understanding can be achieved through reading survivor accounts such as these, and what light do they shed on genocide as experienced by those who lived through it? In other words, from ground level. It's all well and good to see things from the perspective of official documents and ministerial statements and so forth. What does it mean for those who lived through these experiences? We'll start with Sevli Krikorian. Sevli's testimony begins when she was only a 4-year-old child. She describes an occurrence that was really not uncommon during the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians. Indeed, I found this in looking at any genocidal experience. That is the surrender by mothers of their children to, hopefully, friendly families, in this case the Turkish lady, in the hope that by doing so the child's life might be spared. Sevli's testimony, as she related her story, finishes when she was 8 or maybe 9 years of age, which brings up a matter of concern. How much could one so young take in of the events around her and recall later? Perhaps we could say that some of the things she recalled as she got older had a greater ring of authentic memory to them. On the other hand, traumatic images can certainly stay in the forefront of memory even for the youngest children. The threat to her life was indeed one of these. For example, she recalled in some detail a tug of war that took place between the Turkish lady and her 2 sons over her fate. The 2 sons said, "We're going to throw this gavur into the river," when Sevli took her, when the Turkish lady took Sevli home. She remembered that. Then, although the details might have blurred over time, it can be anticipated that she remembered, still at the age of 4, another event, when the Turkish lady, to protect her from her 2 sons, took her and put her into a crevasse, a fissure in a rock, to protect her. She remembered that. Little things, little flashes of memory. So perhaps from the perspective of history, in this instance, we see from this one example, as Sevli understood it, that not all the Turks were bloodthirsty killers. She remembered that this case alone demonstrated a willingness on the part of the Turkish lady to look beyond stereotypes of race or religion for the purpose of saving her own life. That's how Sevli recalled it. Over time, Sevli even forgot her birth mother and eventually called the Turkish lady, it's always mentioned in quotes, the Turkish lady, Mama. The other important recollection we have of Sevli's experience relates to her awareness of difference between herself and those around her. She knew, for example, that she was a gavur, that is to say an infidel, quote unquote. It's not a very nice term. She uses the term a number of times, indicating that she was aware that it meant her relative to everyone else. Alongside of this, she also recognised that the fate of all gavurs was death. And she understood that at some point this would also mean her. Not bad for a little girl. The main elements in Sevli's story are the small points of memory that would stay in the mind of a young child growing to maturity. And she mentions a number of things time and time again, which without the context won't mean very much, unfortunately, to you, but she mentions ointment, a bucket, the river, gavurs, a donkey cart, the orphanage, because she finished up in an orphanage, raisins, a single walnut that was given to her by a passerby. And she remembers fear always as being in the forefront of her thinking, of her awareness. Broader issues might or might not also have been present, but the details of these could well have been conveyed to Sevely later, and this is something else to think about. Things could have been related to her by others later, for example her cousins who were in the picture, or as a result of subsequent realisations transmitted in other ways. So Sevely's account, while problematical in a number of ways, is nonetheless highly evocative of the period of the genocide, and it's a deeply intimate recounting of a single experience, a tiny piece of the jigsaw that can help us to generate some small measure of understanding. I'll speak briefly about Reverend Joseph Nahum. I mentioned that his testimony was published in 1920. It was based on his own experiences as well as his observations and conversations with others. His aim was to inform readers overseas of these events, which had been overshadowed by the more general horrors of the war. His account narrates the horrors experienced by the Assyrians prior to and during World War I. I said earlier that Father Nahum came from the Turkish city of Urfa. In 1915 and 1916, the Young Turks hit both the Armenians and the Assyrians of Urfa, resulting in an estimated loss of some 40% of the city's pre-war total. His account, told very personally, gives an indication of just how horrific were the sufferings his people endured. The account begins with the recognition of the willingness of others to put their well-being at risk in order to help Nahum's family. Even during these terrible and uncertain times, he shows us there were good people who overlooked government directives. Indeed, he managed to effect his escape as a result of the assistance of others. Disguised as a Bedouin, he passed relatively undetected through Turkish society and among Turkish soldiers and gendarmes, even though on the train that took him to Aleppo, to Syria, he was singled out and harassed as an Arab. The significance of this, I think, speaks for itself. While it was obvious that the Ottomans were genocidal in their policies towards Christians and discriminatory towards others, the Turks of this time were also aware of ethnic and racial differences among their fellow Muslims. Father Nahum's account is important in another respect. He shows us how the perpetrators didn't distinguish between Christians, regardless of whether they were Assyrians, Armenians or Greeks. For the Turks, all were infidels, deserving of their fate, and in this lies an important clue as to why they behaved as they did. By combining all groups together without apparent distinction, they were showing their true colours as the destroyers of a specific religious group, notwithstanding that they were from three distinct and unrelated ethnicities. A few words about Papayannis. The city of Trebizond, modern Turkish name is Trabzon, is a city on the Black Sea coast of northeastern Turkey. In April 1916 it was captured by the Russians, who permitted the area to be governed by local Greek religious and civic leaders. Not too far from Trebizond is the coastal village of Espie, from where the family of Tamama, headed by Papayannis, had lived, it was said, for as long as people could remember. The people of the town clearly identified strongly with their village, and their sense of loss when they were deported from it is reflective of the importance of place to the victims of genocide. This was alluded to earlier by Her Excellency the Consul. In the testimony of Papayannis, we can understand why it is that the victims of genocide find themselves so disoriented when forced to move so far and so fast from their homes. Deportation of the entire population in the depths of winter in circumstances of starvation and sickness, and continually lengthening the journey, was debilitating to those on what was rapidly becoming a death march. Added to this were continual attacks from unsupervised local guerrilla groups. On the morning of Sunday, November 16th, 1916, as it was put in the testimony on the road to Golgotha, the town crier, as it was written, went around the Greek houses and summoned all the Greeks to gather shortly in front of the church, bringing with them only what they could carry. At 11 a.m, the entire population of 480 then began their trek out of the village. As they left, they looked at Espia for the last time. As they turned towards where their village had been, some felt the end had come, the more so when they saw smoke billowing from the direction of Espia. Papianus took up the rear as he had waited behind to stay with his brother Costas, who was sick. Before they'd progressed too far, Papianus attempted to negotiate with an officer over the fate of Costas. But this was to no avail. Everyone from the village was forced to leave, even Costas, who, we learn later, died as a result of his treatment on the march. The account notes that, I'll quote it directly, the road they had taken was a road without return. The destruction of the Pontic Greeks and the forcible deportation that followed had but a single planned outcome. I don't need to say this to an audience such as you. It was the attempt for the removal of all Greeks from Turkey. The case of Papianus, his family and his village, is but a cameo in a much bigger drama, but it is illustrative of thousands and thousands of such similar cases that made up the whole throughout all the Greek areas of the Ottoman Empire. With time in mind, I want to reflect briefly if I can, on the nature of how we assess survivor accounts. How may survivor testimonies be assessed, if you like? I'm a historian. How can we do this as sources of history? These are a type of memoir that needs to be read differently from other forms of historical documentation, and I alluded to that earlier. Survivor accounts chronicle events either directly witnessed by their authors or told to them by others at the time of their ordeal. It's the truth of these events that genocide survivors attempt to impart. What is the historian, coming on the scene much later, to do with such material? Survivors aim to tell their story in as clear a manner as possible, the better to be able to convey to their audience the essence of what they went through. In a court of law, such evidence serves a different purpose to that of the historian. The evidence a judge is seeking is altogether different from that of the historian. In a courtroom, the prosecution, defence, judge and jury all look for specific evidence of a precise type, the kind of evidence that will either acquit or convict a person against whom a certain charge has been brought. The questions asked, therefore, are of a very different nature, a very special nature. Generally speaking, in a courtroom, they don't look for the textures, the smells, the sights, the contours of a person's experience. Nor, all too often, do they not explore the wider contextual backdrop against which such things occurred. The historian of genocide not only uses all these things in an effort to reach an understanding of the past, he or she will also permit the survivor to discuss what made a special impression at the time. Such testimony is thus based on an entirely different attitude to events than that found in a courtroom. And even if it would not always pass for, I've got to be very careful my use of language here, as the truth, as a court would require it, it's nonetheless often more valuable for the historian than the kind of response which questions from a judge or an attorney might elicit. The historian cannot dismiss a survivor's impressions of an incident once it's firmly established the survivor saw it take place. Especially in the field of genocide, there are cases where only one witness has survived. And nevertheless, or even because of this, the evidence that person brings is of value, often immensely so. What may we know of such things where no one survived to tell the tale? How does one establish what happened in a community where a population once numbering several hundreds or even several thousands has been completely obliterated? From whom does one obtain eyewitness testimony if all the eyewitnesses have been killed? How does one examine written records where none were kept, but that all you have available is the oral testimony of someone who was there? How did genocide manifest itself in these communities? That's the key, that's the question. We might never know. But the use of testimony, however fragmentary it might be, will start the process of rescuing history from oblivion. And for this alone, in my view, all testimonial accounts are of use. Above all, survivors are mostly interested in conveying to their readers a sense of what happened to them as they remember it. Do they wish to be... Survivors are human. Do they wish to be seen in a particular light? Perhaps. Is their intention to tell the truth as they understand it? Certainly. Do they hope to compose a particular set of images concerning their persecutors or humanity in general? Sure. Overall, though, the reflections and reminiscences of genocide survivors are intimate accounts of individual experiences which the survivors wish to share with others. That sharing is a most important dimension to what it is I'm trying to say here. Implanted within this need to tell the story as they know it is a particular consciousness of what surviving is all about. Where genocide survivors are concerned, the need to bear witness is often part and parcel of the reason for survival itself. Survival is a specific kind of experience, and surviving in order to bear witness is one of its forms. It permits the survivor to allow the dead their voice. It serves as a call to humanity, a signal to all those observing of the power of radical evil, a warning for the generations of the future. This is what survivors are trying to tell us through their accounts. Thus, many survivors identify a powerful duty to get their story down as accurately as possible as they remember it. As Professor of Literature Shoshana Feldman has put it, quote, "To bear witness is to take responsibility for the truth." Except in rare cases, survivor accounts don't ask us to try to imagine their experience. For the most part, that's not what they're attempting to achieve. For many, it's simply sufficient to tell their story, to record, to bear witness, to show that the world through which they lived was in fact all too real. The challenge is not one of imagining. Rather, it's of conveying to the world an understanding of what the survivor went through, of explaining the essence of the evil that one group of people inflicted upon another as seen from the perspective of one who was there. And soon enough, there won't be any left to be able to help us with that. Testimonies do not attempt to make magic. They don't try to imagine the unimaginable. Survivors simply try to tell the story from their own individual perspective, as we see in the examples of Sevli Krikorian, Father Joseph Naim, and Papa Yanis. In different ways, each has provided us with a searing account of a hideous encounter with the vilest expression of human malevolence. And in so doing, they've enhanced, I'd like to think, they've enhanced our understanding. And it's all about understanding. Understanding of the genocidal experience these three Christian communities underwent at the hands of the Ottoman Turks during World War I. Thank you for your attention.